Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, happy to be here. My name is Matt Ryan. So I am an associate professor at Cornell University, and I really like talking about ecological weed management. So my background is in ecological weed management. I focus my PhD research on looking at different ways to manage weeds in organic cropping systems, and have done a lot of work with organic no-till. But today, I'm going to be talking about different strategies here. And I hope that there are some questions, that there's some time for discussion at the end. I have probably more slides than I should have, but I'm going to try to go through these. And if we don't get through everything, that's okay, I think. But just to start off, I wanted to start with this definition of ecological weed management. Just make sure everyone's really clear about what we're talking about. So I think of ecological weed management as being a strategy, this proactive and strategic use of complementary control tactics. Notice that's plural, so multiple tactics here based on knowledge of weeds, right? Based on knowledge of weeds, this is where the ecology part comes in and how they interact with their environment. So this is maybe a different approach to traditional weed science, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about ecological weed management and a lot of opportunities for ecological weed management to play a role in organic cropping systems. So I also like to contrast this with reactive management. Typically, traditional weed science, weed management, weed control is reactive, right? You have weed seedlings coming up and you're going out and trying to kill them. So instead of doing that, right, what we're trying to do is really reduce selection for adapted species. Think about weed community assembly. Why are the weeds there that are there? Increase crop competitiveness, right? You want to increase the relative competitive ability of your crop against those weeds. You can reduce weed seed production and weed propagule production if you're talking about perennials, right? So reducing weed reproduction. And then preventing introductions, right? So that's another thing. Prevention is a big part of ecological weed management. It's a big tenet in organic agriculture. So prevention goes a long way, and so that's a big part of the strategy here with ecological weed management. Okay, so I want to make this, as practical and as applied as possible. Thinking about weeds, I think it's really important. Of course, there's issues with yield, but they reduce profitability. I think I do a lot of work with organic agriculture and often talking with students. So I teach and I do research. Talk with students about the yield gap between organic and conventional agriculture. And a lot of times it's coming down to weeds. Weeds are a big problem, a big issue, a big major reason for that yield gap. I also see that when you have fewer weeds, that just makes things a lot easier. When you're going out and harvesting, it's a lot easier to get through with your combine, a lot fewer problems. And then also you can increase resilience to extreme weather. Okay, so that last one may not sound familiar to you, but in my work we see that we have these problems. This is an example of yield loss. Okay, and so this is in a normal year. This is part of our long-term cropping systems experiment at Cornell University, and we have 4 different systems, right? We have a high fertility system, a low fertility system, an enhanced weed management system, and a reduced tillage system. This reduced tillage system, by the way, this is for this year. This was not the rolled crimp system, okay? But this is more of a chisel plow system. Anyway, so under normal conditions, we're seeing 5 bushel per acre yield loss, ranging from 0 up to 13% yield loss, okay? So when we talk about resilience to extreme weather, when we had a drought back in 2012, okay, this is where we were seeing a major yield loss. When it's dry, weeds can really suck up the moisture and reduce your yields. So that's what I mean about building resilience to extreme weather. Of course, when we have too much, when we have wet conditions, right, you can't go out and cultivate if you're relying on cultivation. That can be problematic. So if you have fewer weeds in your system, again, when we have these extreme dry conditions like this or extreme wet conditions, you can be in a better position if you have fewer weeds to deal with. So here, we're talking about, if you look at this 15 bushel per acre yield difference, and we're looking at the different systems here, and if you calculate that out, that can be quite a bit of money, $500–600 per acre, if you're getting into that. So big opportunities for increasing profitability with improving your weed management. So again, thinking that I want to make this applied and really practical and relevant for you. So as we go through this presentation, I want you to be thinking about these questions. where on your farm are the problem areas? Okay, so just take a moment, think about this. Where are the infested fields? What species do you have there? A big part of weed ecology, ecological weed management is knowing which species you're dealing with. And once you know what species you're dealing with, the management will be easier, right? And then the last question there, that's maybe the most important. Again, thinking about taking this proactive approach, trying to understand why are there weed problems to begin with. Getting away from this reactive management. Okay, there are weeds there, I need to go out and kill them. Well, let's take a step back and think about why there are weeds there to begin with. Okay, what were the conditions? What is the cause of that problem? Okay, of course, the last question that's not up there, right, is hopefully at the end you will be able to have some ideas about this. But what are you going to do to help yourself deal with those problems in those bad areas, right? Okay, so moving forward, there is a book that Dr. Silva and her team made available here at O'Grain. This is from Dr. Chuck Mohler. An excellent resource. He goes through and has so much information. It's quite a thick book here. This is available for free online as a PDF. I really encourage you to check this out. Okay, so you go through and again, knowing the species on your farm. There's a whole section of this book that's based on individual species, and it goes through the most common species that we're dealing with as organic farmers. And it has a lot of information about the ecology, the biology of those species, and management tips. So, that second bullet point, understanding the biology of weeds, really helps you exploit their weaknesses. Okay, so that's a major point of this book. And then those important characteristics in that section that goes through the different species. There's information, of course, the first one, annual versus perennial. That's a huge one, right? You want to make sure you know that. Emergence timing. That's something else that's really important. Once you know the emergence timing of the species that you're dealing with, you can better manage those species. Seed persistence in the soil. Some species persist for a really long period of time. Some species actually go away quite quickly if you prevent weed seed additions. Okay, seed size, tolerance to mulch, competitiveness with crops or shade tolerance. These are other traits that are really important that will help you manage and design, tweak your system so that you can reduce your weed problems. Okay?
So just to clarify, Matt, and for everybody, so we bought 100 copies of this book. They're available at the registration desk. First come, first serve. If you have a couple people from, say, single farm, please just take one copy. But Matt recommended it, and we just want to make sure that that resource is available. If you don't get a copy, or if you don't want a hard copy, like Matt said, there's a PDF available. But the copies are at the registration desk if you didn't realize that you could grab one.
Yeah, I just think that's so cool that that Erin and her team were put the money up to purchase those copies and bring them in, make them available to you. Again, an excellent resource. So do take advantage, check it out. Again, I mentioned this is from Chuck Mohler, and so Chuck passed away 2 years ago, unfortunately, and but before leaving us, he really did quite a bit of amazing work with weed ecology, ecological weed management. He basically wrote the book on the subject here with Matt Lehman and Charles Staver. So ecological management of agricultural weeds, so that's that top one there. He's also written a number of other books. So he was a mentor to me at Cornell University. He had a lot of great ideas, helped me so much along the way with early in my career, get started with thinking about these different things. The other book there, Crop Rotations on Organic Farms, or Crop Rotation on Organic Farms, that's an excellent book, and I have some slides that have some images from that book. Again, that was published through SARE, and that's available online for free. So do check out these resources. A lot of great information in there. I learn things every time I reread these books. So just to start off, when we think about ecological weed management, I feel like the foundation, what everybody should be starting with when they think about how to improve, how to make their system better, is really rotation. And so that book, that other book that I mentioned here, Crop Rotation on Organic Farms, this is a quote from Chuck in that book: "Rotation planning is a key way organic growers can substitute brain power for labor and purchase input. So I feel like that is so true, and getting your rotation is right, and having a diverse rotation, really the foundation of a good weed management plan. Okay, so here, this is a quote from 1938. A lot of this is not new information, the strength and the importance of crop rotation. Again, from 1938, this is a quote: "Crop rotation is the most effective means yet devised for keeping land free of weeds," right? So, it's been known for a long time, but with the onset or the introduction of herbicides and agrochemicals in the 1930s and 40s, we really got away from this. And this is older knowledge, and I feel like people need to be reminded of this strength and the power of a good diverse crop rotation in keeping your farm weed-free, or at least manageable with weeds, okay? So in that book, here are some rotation guidelines. This is from the book, but an image there in the middle. This is from Klaus and Peter Martin's farm. Klaus Martin's and Mary Howell Martin's farm in Penn Yan, New York, which is not too far from us at Cornell University. They run Lakeview Organic Grain and then Seneca Bean and Grain. But just some rotation guidelines from the book here. In Klaus Martin's here, they're in this version, okay, they were growing corn, soybean, and then wheat and red clover, okay? So that was their standard rotation, but thinking about the strategic integration of different crops and putting them together in a sequence. This is something that I think quite a bit about. How do we do this, especially with our organic no-till work? But some guidelines from Chuck Mohler in the book. You want to be alternating spring and early summer planted crops with fall planted crops. That may be pretty obvious. Alternating wide row, 30-inch row crops with narrow row crops, right? So row crops with small grains, okay? Crops that are harvested differently, so forage crops and grain crops. And then crops, if you can integrate livestock, that is even better, right? So just these, basic strategies, really, really important, okay? In our long-term experiment that we have, I was showing you some yield loss data from that before. This was an experiment, again, started by Chuck Mohler, and a really big influence in my work at Cornell. This is our crop rotation, and from the previous years, okay? It's changed now slightly, but it started off with a corn, soybean, spelt, and red clover rotation, okay? And this rotation, again, this is really powerful. This is integrating that small grain with the row crops. And when we've collected data and looked at this, we go out and we collect data every year. We look at weed biomass production and then weed density, right, as well. So when we look at these two metrics of weed abundance together, it really tells an interesting story about the power of having that spelt in this row crop dominated rotation, right? So what we're looking at here in the bars on the left is weed density, okay? And so you can see in corn and soybean, very low weed density, okay? But on that right y-axis is the average weed size, and that's that circle, that little dot there. So we have a few number of weeds, but they're large weeds. And those weeds are going to seed, right? They're producing viable seed, and that's contributing to the soil weed seed bank. So when we have certain density in corn, but they're large, they go to seed, we have even more weeds in soybean sometimes, and those weeds in soybean, they get larger. Once they breach the canopy, they actually get larger than when they're in corn. Corn is a good competitor. But in soybean, those weeds can get quite large. When we rotate the spelt, okay, this is where the important part is. When we rotate the spelt, we have a lot of weeds out there. We have a high density of weeds, okay, but they stay very small. And we go out and we combine and harvest that spelt before they set seed. All right, so that's our way to keep our population low, right? So we're preventing weed seed additions in that spelt year by having that early harvest. Okay, and then we go back into corn, and our weed density is low again. So this is a very good sequence for us in terms of keeping our weed populations low. And something I think people don't really think about so much, but having that small grain harvested early, preventing weed seed production that year can be really, really important. Okay, another thing that's often talked about with ecological weed management is this concept of the many little hammers. How many people have heard of this before? This concept, many little hammers. So people talk about this quite a bit in weed management circles. So Matt Liebman and Eric Gallant from Maine, they developed this concept in a book chapter that they wrote in 1997. This is, I think, has really had a big impact over the years. This really set the stage for a lot of thinking about ecological weed management. But in their chapter, they talk about how combinations of tactics, these combinations of tactics, these cultural weed management practices that when applied in isolation are typically not very effective. All right, you're doing this little thing over here, and you might get a slight reduction of your weeds. But when you combine these tactics together, all right, they can be as effective as some of these other things that people are using, these other big hammers, if you will, for weed suppression, right? The other benefit of using multiple tactics like this is that you can reduce the risk by spreading the burden of protection across the different tactics, right? So if one tactic fails, you have something else to pick up the slack there, okay? Also, you can avoid selecting for adapted species, okay? So that's another thing that happens. When we think about weed community assembly, sometimes you have these practices, and if you use these practices over and over, you have adapted species. In conventional management, this is herbicide-resistant weeds, right? So that's a problem. If conventional farmers were using more diverse practices, they wouldn't have that selection pressure, and they wouldn't have this problem of herbicide-resistant weeds that they have. There's also this other really cool thing, this last bullet point, something that I've put a lot of thought into and sunk a lot of my research time into is this idea of interactions between tactics and the possibility for synergism between tactics. This is something that I think is really cool when you can have two things that maybe don't work so well on their own. You put them together and all of a sudden you have really good weed suppression. So this potential for synergism and then the opportunity to improve the efficacy of density-dependent tactics. So that might sound a little strange to you. Density-dependent, well, what does that mean? Well, if you have more weeds, the tactic doesn't work as well. So when we talk about weed zapping, for example, electrocution, so if you have a lot of weeds out in your field, the weed zapper is not going to work as well. That electricity is being diluted by the different plants out there, and if you have more weeds out there, less electricity is going to any one individual. Okay? So that's what I mean by density-dependent tactics. But cultural practices are so important, and so, let's see. Jumping ahead here. Cultural practices, so many little hammers, this idea of many little hammers is really focused on cultural weed management practices. All right, this is like really any tweak to your system. So much of what we do with our management, of our cropping system management, will have an impact on weeds. And so it's really any tweak that you could do to your general management of your system, of your crop or your cropping system, that will contribute to increasing the competitiveness of your crop or helping regulate weeds. That's a cultural weed management practice. So here we have some examples of delaying planting in the spring until the soil warms up, right? So when we have warmer soil, that's when our crop is more vigorous and is more competitive against those weeds, right? Increasing seeding rate, that's a way to increase shading. Same with row spacing, using narrow row spacing. These are all little things that we could be doing in our system that will help with weed management. If you're growing vegetables, you can transplant seedlings, establish a hierarchy. Size hierarchy here, where you want large crops, small weeds. Increase that competitive ability of the crop relative to the weed. Applying fertilizer, irrigation close to the crop row, that can be beneficial. Selecting crop varieties with early vigor and bushy growth, right? This example here, the photograph, that's a low seeding rate in soybean and a high seeding rate. So certainly opportunities for weed management there with these cultural weed management practices. Here's some work, an example of synergism with cultural weed management tactics. This is from Randy Anderson with the USDA, and he was looking at different tactics, and when he was putting them together, he saw some synergism when you had 3 or more tactics. And so he, in this example with corn and sunflower here, when he's showing the 3 tactics, that's when you're getting that bump, and the synergism between the 3 tactics improve the competitiveness or the weed biomass reduction 3 to 5-fold. So. Interesting example of just how these different tactics can be combined and can lead to improved weed management. Another thing I want to talk about is weed emergence timing, right? And so when you think about weed ecology, understanding how the weeds, different species behave, right? So here are 3 common species: red root pigweed, giant foxtail, common ragweed. We have, these species are quite common in the east, in Pennsylvania and New York. And so what you're looking at is a violin plot, okay? And so the wider of that bubble, the wider area of that bubble, that indicates when that species is emerging in the soil. And these are fairly consistent within a local area, and so with different biotypes. So common ragweed here emerges earlier than giant foxtail and red root pigweed. And so knowing this kind of information, if you know the species out there and you know when they're emerging, you can adjust your planting date to deal with these weeds, right? So one strategy is planting earlier, and so trying to get your crop established and trying to get your crop up and competitive before those weeds emerge. That's one strategy. Another strategy is to push your planting date back a little bit, prep your soil, let those weeds emerge, and then terminate them before you plant your crop. Right? So this is something, done a lot of work with weed emergence periodicity. This is just one kind of small example here. This is another example from some research that I was leading at Cornell, where we had 4 different sites across the Northeast here. And what we saw was that emergence timing varied a little bit by site. So some species were a little bit different, okay? But this is when species were emerging. This is in a paper. You can find this graphics, pretty easy to access online. But given that the emergence timing varied by site, what I suggest to all of you is that you should really be paying attention to your species on your farm, because you have different biotypes out there. Even though it may be the same species, sometimes a different biotype may be emerging at a slightly different time. But knowing this information, again, is knowledge that you can put into use. Okay, so an example here. So this is an example from the Rodale Institute when I was down there in the early 2000s. We were looking at different planting dates, and so the soil was tilled at the same time, okay, in the 2 different plots here. In the plot where it was planted late, there was an opportunity for a false seed bed. Okay, this is where we went in and basically terminated any weeds that emerged before planting. In the picture on the other side over there, in June 2nd, okay, on the right, that's where it was planted right away without that false seed bed. And you can see the difference, the big visual difference here. A lot more weeds when you plant right away and when you don't let those weeds come up and terminate them, like we did with that later planting date. So this false seed bed, this concept of a false seed bed, this can be very, very effective. For people that are not doing this, I think you should really think about doing it if you have weed problems, if you're struggling with weed management issues. This is going out, prepping your seed bed, encouraging weeds to emerge, and then doing successive cultivation events at progressively shallower depths. Sometimes there's only an opportunity to get out one flush. Other times, if you have a larger window, you can do this multiple times and really clean up the field before going in and planting your crop. Okay? One issue with this, again, with row crops is the timing. And so here in that same example, okay, the 2 different soybean plots, one was maturing much faster. The other one was questionable of whether or not that was going to mature on time and make a good crop. So certainly fewer weeds over there, looking pretty clean. Where it was weedy, that had a lot of weeds to deal with, but certainly that crop is going to finish up earlier. So you need to balance this. This is information. The concept, I think, is what I want to convey. You need to adapt it really to your system if you want to try to make this tactic, this approach work. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about is this concept of weeding the soil and not the crop. This is a phrase that really comes from Ann and Eric Nordell. These are vegetable farmers from Pennsylvania. So they have a market garden close to Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And they've done some really amazing work with weed management. They farm with horses. They don't use tractors, equipment like that. And they really set up their farm to reduce labor requirements. Okay, they liked working together. They didn't want to have your typical vegetable farm where they have a whole herd of people coming in every summer to pull weeds. And so they really felt like weed management was their biggest labor use or labor requirement. So they set up their whole system to reduce weeds. Okay, and so they have a really interesting approach. They have zero tolerance for weed seed production. Okay, so this is maybe unheard of, to some people. All right, this is really extreme kind of management here. But what they've done is really reduced and eliminated weed seeds from their soil weed seed bank. Okay, they do this using a bioextensive approach. Okay, they basically take land out of production for a year. Okay, and there's their rotation up in the corner there. But they have this period where they grow a cover crop and then they do a bare fallow. It's kind of like an extended false seed bed. Okay, but they do this bare fallow period where they're using skim plowing to go out and terminate any weeds that emerge. And they can alter the timing of that bare fallow based on the weeds that are coming into their farm, okay, that are showing up. And so this has been very, very effective for them. Really impressive. Really kind of makes people think about, the soil weed seed bank. Is that possible to reduce? And they've shown, they've demonstrated that it is possible. And again, they're quite successful with this, using tools that are basically horse-drawn tools. So again, this requires a different approach, taking land out of production, taking a whole year to basically get their soil weed seed bank drawn down. I've been to their farm before a couple of different times, and it's so impressive to go out and see a beautiful organic farm like this and have absolutely no weeds. I think I found one weed, and it was a dandelion, okay, on their farm, and like walking around for a while here, and there's just one weed, okay? And it's so very impressive. Dandelion, as you know, can blow in, so it's really hard to just constantly eliminate that from your soil seed bank because it's always blowing in. But very, very impressive. Other people have went to their farm and sampled the soil there and have done germination bioassays over on the right there. You can see that's their soil, and it's free of weed seedlings there. There were a couple of seedlings that came up, but they were volunteer tomato plants. Okay, so this is Eric Gallant's work from up in Maine. Really impressive, though, this strategy. And this gets to the idea of seed persistence in the soil. And so what you're seeing here, right, is a graph of seed viability, okay, and then years after burial. And so this is some research that was done with wild buckwheat and common lambscotters. And so the idea here is, people get it in their head that, okay, you have weeds in the soil seed bank, and there's dormancy, and they're going to be there forever. And that's really not a good message. I feel like the message really should be that you have rapid reduction within the first year of your seed viability. Okay, and so you can actually have put this to work for you and take advantage of this. If you can keep your fields clean and prevent weed seed reductions or additions for a whole year or multiple years, you can really drive down your soil weed seed bank. Okay, so there are a few, like lambscotters is a species that tends to persist a bit longer than other species. So, and you can see there are a few species out there, or a few seeds that will persist for a very long period of time. So 20 years after burial, you can still find some viable seeds. However, that's the exception, though. The majority here are being lost, and the viability is being lost very early on. So keep this in mind. Eric Gallant up in Maine, he did some research testing this approach where he had a weedy plot, and I believe this was on farm, and then he implemented a policy of zero tolerance for weed seed additions. He did this 2 years in a row, so 2007 and in 2008. And you can see the zero tolerance for weed seed additions reduced the next year's seed bank by 45 to 93%. So just in a single year, if you prevent weeds from going to seed and you prevent those seed additions, you can drastically reduce your seed bank. So if you have a lot of weed problems, you should be considering, take land out of production or do what is needed to prevent weed seed production. Okay? So far, we have really been talking about annual weeds, right? Annual weeds that are producing seed that are contributing to the soil weed seed bank. When I had those questions up and I was asking you to think about problematic weeds and fields on your farm, this is the kind of image that came to my mind. This is a field at our research farm, and this is pretty scary stuff here. This is Canada thistle, right? And so this is when I was taking over this field and managing it, and coming into this, and it was basically a disaster, right? That is like a forest of Canada thistle there. I had another photo. I still have it in here. This is our spelt, okay? And it's totally infested with Canada thistle. And so, this requires a different type of management, right? So the seed bank persistence issues that we were talking about before, that doesn't really apply to perennial weeds like this that have a rhizome. So this is, really bad stuff. Canada thistle often comes into small grains like this, winter wheat, for example, and it lines up so that it actually sets seeds and produces seeds, which can then blow around and can contaminate, infest other fields. So it's really problematic if you have it in small grains like this. It doesn't necessarily always reproduce mainly from those seeds. It's reproducing from rhizomes, right? So doing some a little bit of research here, I took these 1 gram rhizome segments. Okay, so this is in a greenhouse. Put them in pots here under optimal conditions. But after 25 days of growth, after planting a 1 gram rhizome segment in the greenhouse, this is the growth in that other picture on the right there. So quite a bit of growth in just 25 days, and from a really little segment of rhizome. So when you're thinking about managing perennial weeds like this, you really need to be careful about how you're doing it. Sometimes, using cultivation, you can actually cause more of a problem, do more harm than good with this. So you need to be careful with this and be strategic about it. If you go out and just go through with a rototiller, for example, go through once, you can actually spread this problem around and make it worse. Okay? So that's something that you want to avoid. But there's been a lot of research looking at perennial weeds, not only like Canada thistle, other ones like hedge bindweed and quackgrass in addition to Canada thistle. And the strategy here that works, and this is really outlined in the book that I was talking about earlier, but what you want to be doing is really waiting for those rhizomes to reach a minimum, a point when they are almost fully exhausted all the carbohydrate reserves in the rhizome by producing shoots. And so with hedge bindweed, that's like when the hedge bindweed is 12 to 28 inches long or has 4 to 6 leaves on it. With Canada thistle, it's about when it's a foot tall. With quackgrass, the time when the rhizomes have those root reserves reach a minimum, and that's around the 3 to 4 leaf stage. So when it reaches the minimum, when they're almost fully exhausted, that's when you want to be hitting them with cultivation. Okay, and successive cultivation events. So you really you can easily remove perennial weeds like this with bare fallow periods where you're doing successive cultivation events when you're doing it at the right time like this. Okay. Question over here.
How often would you do cultivation after this? You're talking about succession.
Yeah. So when it reaches the 3 to 4 leaf stage with quackgrass, for example, you go in and cultivate, all right, and then you let it grow up again to that point, 3 to 4 leaf stage, and then you cultivate again. And if you could do that 4 times in a row, you can really knock back your population. Okay. An example of another approach or an additional kind of strategy tactic with this, okay. So if you're chopping up those rhizomes and you're doing it when the rhizomes are at their lowest level of their carbohydrate reserves, another approach is to use some mechanical tools to bring those rhizomes to the soil surface to help desiccate them. Okay, so this is possible with some different types of equipment. This is from an article, an old New Farm article from Rodale, where there was a Canadian farmer that was sharing their strategy about how they do this. And they're going through, dealing with Canada thistle like this, going through with a cultivator without sweeps on it. So just basically a shank that goes down and it will pull up those rhizomes right to the soil surface, and then it'll help desiccate them, help dry them out. Okay, so that, again, these perennial weeds can be really problematic. I know a lot of people struggle with them, but you should know that there are strategies. It may not be something that you want to do, taking land out of production or using a bare fallow, but it can be very, very effective. And I strongly encourage you to do that rather than continuing to deal with it with other management tactics that are perhaps less effective. Okay. So thinking about this, we have this idea that was really promoted by Ann and Eric Nordell of weeding the soil, not the crop, reducing your soil weed seed bank, basically cleaning up your fields to an extreme extent, right? And so this involves, and there's a really focus on long-term weed population management, driving down those populations. So it involves using false seed bedding, right, and cover crops. What's really nice about their approach, those high biomass cover crops that they're using, they sandwich that bare fallow period. So they may be doing some damage to their soil by doing the bare fallow, but the addition of the cover crop before and after really helps keep their soil in good shape. So think about this as a system here. So, with this approach, again, using false seed bedding or these bare fallows and weeding the soil, not the crop, right? Another approach, okay, and I feel like it's interesting to see people be very successful using totally different approaches. The other approach that I would characterize as having the right tool for the job, okay, and this is maybe, borderlines, more reactive management to some extent, but, this is another approach that I've seen farmers be very successful with, okay, and I think it's interesting to think about the differences here, right? So the idea here with the philosophy of having the right tool for the job is that weeds are really part of the system. Can't ever get rid of them. They're always coming in one way or another, and so they're just there, okay? And so I think farmers that subscribe to this approach, they just consider weeds to be part of the system and kind of don't really think about this possibility of eliminating them. And their approach here with this, when you're successful with using the right tool for the job, this kind of philosophy, weeds are really managed using the right tools and giving the crops a competitive advantage, establishing a size hierarchy, okay? So here's a photograph. This is Tor Oshner, a local farmer near Ithaca, New York, that I work with, and is showing off his cultivator to some of the students that are brought out to his farm. But this approach is really managing competition during the critical weed-free period. And so the critical weed-free period is this time in the crop growth stage where if you keep weeds out of the crop, then you're not going to have crop yield loss. Okay? So very different approach than what we were talking about just before. So I would say that there's potential for greater short-term profitability with this. Okay, if you're not having to take land out of production, do a bare fallow, you might be able to maybe retain some greater profitability. What you're really trying to do is manage competition. Okay, instead of population management, you're trying to manage competition here, having large crops and small weeds. If you have large crops and small weeds, the weeds won't compete with the crop. And so here there's zero tolerance for weeds growing above the crop, right? So that's this contrasting approach. Here's some data, some information about the critical weed-free period for common crops. So for corn, it's basically V1 to V6. And for soybean, it's V3. So if you keep weeds out of your soybean up to the V3, the third leaf stage there, you're not going to have yield loss. A lot of data out there showing this. And so these values, these literature values are established for different common crops that are out there. And so, again, managing competition with this approach is really the strategy. With mechanical weed management, if you're doing this type of approach, timing is really important. So timing, I think during the talk in the morning, really great information there. It was exciting to see that. Timing being so critical here. So when you're using cultivation, for example, blind cultivation, really that white thread stage is so critical. That's when you have the best chance of killing those weeds and having the best bang for your buck, if you will, okay? That's when those weeds are most sensitive to environmental conditions. And I've heard from a number of people that if you're on your tractor and you're looking down and you can see weeds, you've already have waited too long, right? You want to only see those weeds after you get off your tractor, go behind, after you're tine weeding or rotary hoeing, and you see those white threads on the soil surface. That's when you know you're hitting it right, okay? Of course, many weeds are also managed at the seedling stage, okay? They're also quite vulnerable, okay, to soil disturbance. And so the danger here is that it's a short window. For some species, giant ragweed, for example, the seedling stage is very short in terms of when it's susceptible. And you can also have rerooting. So this is common ragweed. In this case, the common ragweed was dragged across a couple feet there and then was able to reroot. I hear that's much more common with giant ragweed. It can be dragged across the field and then reroot if it's large enough. But something that you want to consider, timing being so critical here. So when weeds are small, that's when you really want to be managing for those, trying to reduce those populations, get them out of there, keep that crop clean for that critical weed-free period. Okay, so Also wanted to just highlight some cultivation equipment. I feel like there are a lot of opportunities for integrating technology with ecology. You know, sometimes people think about ecology and they think about, okay, well, we're just going to do it the old way. And I'd say that's maybe you're missing some opportunities here. I feel like tremendous opportunities with camera-guided systems, cultivation systems. This is one that's being used by Tor Oshner. So you're seeing the sensing camera here, over here, and then the side shifter, you know, that's in the upper right, and then the monitor there in the tractor. He also has another camera on the back, so you can see exactly what the cultivator is doing. And so that's that second screen right below the monitoring monitor there, or the cultivation monitor. Right below it is the vision monitor for seeing what's happening behind the tractor there. Okay, so there's Tor talking about his equipment. So this cultivator, it also has different options that are available. You can put on finger weeders there. You can have some tine weeders that can be attached. And so when he first got this, he went and tried all the different attachments to see what he liked. Thought that was really interesting. But again, the sensing camera in the back, the side shifter, the viewing camera also hooked to the back there, and then you know, the different components. So I'd say a lot of opportunities with some new equipment, new technology that will help us manage our weeds better, even if we are thinking ecologically about it. Okay. So contrasting philosophies here. Okay. And so, you know, on the one side, we have this weed the soil, not the crop, this bioextensive approach. This really requires advanced planning. Okay, it's less dependent on the weather. Okay, that's something to keep in mind here. Reduces labor before and after planting. Okay, so you're not spending time weeding your crop. Okay, but the downside is that you have to stay on top of it, right? If you have a few areas where you do have some weed seed production, it can really set you back. Okay, you have to start the whole process, and once you get your seed bank down, it's a lot easier to maintain it. So the first years that they were doing this, they really put in a lot of work, you know, to go out, do those bare fallows. After they've done that for several years, they were able to back off some of that, and it became much easier. On the other side, we have the right tool for the job, right? This is bio-intensive, I would characterize it as. It does not require advanced planning. However, there's a greater risk here. Okay, and when I say risk, there's greater risk if you have wet conditions when you want to go out and cultivate. That's one of the biggest challenges I feel like for organic farmers is when it rains and we can't get out to cultivate and do timely weed management, right? So timeliness and diversity of weed management tools is really important, but it does not require this staying on top of the weed seed production. Okay, so that was a big part of what I wanted to cover here. I want to shift gears here and tell you a little bit about some of the other research that we're doing at Cornell. One of my graduate students just finished up a nice project looking at integrated weed management in organic no-till soybean. So I'm going to share a little bit of that story with you, and then hopefully there's some time at the end for questions. So I know a lot of you already know that you can suppress small-seeded annual weeds with mulch, and this rolled rye cover crop system has been successful. Somewhat consistently with no-till soybean into rolled rye mulch. However, the level of mulch is, I would say, important here. And when you don't have enough mulch, you can have some nasty weed problems. So this is the situation that we were really targeting, going in and trying to clean up these nasty weed problems when we don't have enough mulch, and we're not in a situation when we can go out and just use traditional cultivation equipment. So some new tools that Annika Roland, the graduate student that I'm working with, that she was looking at here, one is this inter-row mower. Okay, so this is a new tool that was custom built for us by an outfit, Artec, up in Manitoba, Canada. So really exciting piece of equipment here. We've done 2 years of research on this now, and I'd say I'm more excited about it than ever. I think it has a lot of potential. For organic no-till research, I really feel like this is a bit of a game changer. Okay, I may we'll see how things look after this next year, but I have really high hopes for this. Note that this is not the only tool out there, right? Over in the corner here, we do have the row shaver, I think, which is one of the first commercially available units that you can buy. Basically, it doesn't need to be custom made. And so this is the same kind of concept, really interesting. See this, going out and mowing your weeds out between the row instead of using soil disturbance and cultivation. Okay? So in Annika's work, what she was doing was looking at 3 different tactics. Again, multiple tactics here, this many little hammers type of approach. Maybe these are slightly bigger hammers, not just cultural practices, but multiple practices. So a high seeding rate, high soybean seeding rate, the inter-row mower, and the weed zapper. So we have a weed zapper out at Cornell, and it's been fun exploring what that can do. But her hypothesis here was that the combination of tactics will be most effective at reducing weed biomass and increasing soybean yield. Okay? And so we put a lot of thought into this design of this experiment, and we really thought about the different tools targeting weeds in different areas. Okay? And so we were thinking that the high soybean seeding rate was going to target weeds right in the row with the soybean. Okay, the inter-row mower would get the weeds between the soybean rows, and the weed zapper would get the weeds that are growing above the soybean canopy. So we thought, okay, that's how things are going to work here. It's all going to come together very nicely. There's also this bit of a temporal component to this as well. So the high seeding rate, that's acting on weeds right away as soon as they're emerging. Okay, the inter-row mower, that's implemented a little bit later, 6 to 8 weeks after planting. And so as weeds are becoming susceptible to being mowed, that's when we're going in with the inter-row mower. And then the weed zapper, that's a bit later. With the weed species that we had, our weeds were growing with the soybean crop, and so we really need to wait for those weeds to get above the soybean canopy before we can go in with the weed zapper to terminate them. So there are these different components, and again, she looked at these tactics both in isolation and in all possible combinations here. Okay? So the high soybean seeding rate, so previous work has shown that this can be very effective at suppressing weeds, and this works through shading, right? So we're increasing that crop competitiveness, and in this example, this is a much lower seeding rate there with that large crabgrass that you can see on the left compared to a high seeding rate. But this is a cultural weed management practice. It's really focused on shading out, increasing the relative competitive ability of the soybean crop relative to the weeds. Okay? Also some potential for soybean lodging, increased seed costs, other things to consider here with this. Okay? The inter-row mower, this is a photograph of the inter-row mower that we were using. So this is basically set up with rotary mowers. They have swing blades on them, somewhat similar to the row shaver there, where if we hit a rock, they don't bend or get damaged. It cuts weeds that are several inches above the soil surface, and it's used approximately 6 to 8 weeks after planting. So this is the replacement of an inter-row cultivator when you're using tillage, right? And so that's what that looked like. Here's a photograph showing without mowing on the left, and then with mowing on the right there. And you can see went through this field that was really infested with wild mustard here, and it did a nice job cleaning it up. Okay, so just an example. And then the weed zapper. Okay, so the weed zapper we talked about. Harold talked about that in the morning. This is I feel like there's been a lot of interest in the weed zapper over the past several years. It's something that I had a lot of high hopes for when we first got this, and it's been interesting to watch what it can and maybe cannot do. So with the weed electrocution using the weed zapper, it really depends on the species. So as Harold was talking about in the morning, plants with a higher water content tend to be more susceptible to weed zapping. Okay, so if it's woody or if it's a drier type of species, it may not be as effective, right? With this, we've had some issues with actually dropping the boom down a little too low and damaging some soybeans. So with any cultivation or any weed management tool, you need to be careful. But also, there's interesting work being done looking at seed viability after weed zapping. So I know with velvet leaf buttonweed, there's some research showing that even when the velvet leaf is hit with the weed zapper, some of that seed that's there can still be viable. With other species, they tend to be less viable. So more work needs to be done with that. The weed species that we had in this experiment were common ragweed, common lambsquaters, and yellow foxtail. We did this at four different fields over two years. And there were other species in some fields, like Venice mallow, for example, or black medic. But these were the species that were most dominant across all four fields, site years, okay? And so what I'm going to show you next are the results, our weed biomass. So we went out and we measured weed biomass at peak weed biomass. So this is when soybean is in the reproductive stage, typically right before weed seed shed, right when we have the greatest amount of weeds out there. So it's when we go out with a quadrat and we can get a good sense for whether or not our weed management practices worked. Okay? So these are our results. And so we have our control treatment over there on the left, and that's where we did nothing. Okay? We have the high seeding rate, the SR, the inter-row mower, IM, and then the weed zapper, WZ. And then the combinations there. And so what we saw in our research, and again, this is somewhat dependent on the species that we have and our conditions, our context, but we saw a 60% reduction with the inter-row mower compared to the control. And so we were really excited about that. It didn't seem to matter if we were adding additional practices to the inter-row mower. We stayed at that 60% reduction across the board here. So I think there's a lot of potential for inter-row mowing. I'm, again, really excited about this approach and the tools that are being developed that are out there. The weed zapping, I feel like the weed zapper has potential, but in this case, those weeds really didn't breach the canopy, get above the canopy, become susceptible to weed zapping before our canopy closed. So it would have been nice to be able to go out there a little bit later, but by that point, our canopy had already closed and we were not able to drive through the field with the weed zapper. So I think that's a big reason why we're not seeing an effect, why we're not seeing a reduction with the weed zapper compared to the control. It's just based on our weed species. If we would have had giant ragweed, for example, or other species that grow really fast and can breach that canopy, get above that canopy, I think our results would look a little bit different. Okay. Interestingly here, so we didn't see a real benefit from the combination of tactics. However, when we look at some of these soybean yield, for example, this is when things get maybe a bit more interesting. We had a weed-free control over on the far right there, and we see even with all the different tactics here, we're still not achieving that yield potential that we see with our weed-free control. So we're still leaving basically yield out in the field here, and there's opportunity for further improvement. But what we did see is with the inter-row mower, that's where we're getting a bit of a yield bump, especially with the inter-row mowing and a higher seeding rate. That's when we're actually having a significant increase in yield over the control. Okay? And we saw that both with the inter-row mower and high seeding rate, and with the inter-row mower, high seeding rate, and weed zapper. Of course, when you're thinking about this, if you're not getting a yield increase that justifies that use of the weed zapper, you've got to think about your return on investment and the cost of running that machine through the field. So perhaps in this case, just the high seeding rate and the inter-row mower would be the best option based on this research under those conditions. Okay. So just a couple other things. Yeah, the combination of the mower and the high seeding rate increased soybean yield compared to the non-weedy control, right? And basically what I was saying before. So just wrapping things up here, some take-home messages. I know we talk about a lot of different things here. Happy to talk about this anytime. You feel free to email me, but just some things to walk away with here. So knowledge is really important, okay? Understanding weed ecology will pay off, okay? If you take the time to understand the weeds that you have out there, do some homework, think about the species, different options that you have for managing those species, I think it's time well spent, okay? Diverse crop rotations and cultural practices should really be the foundation of your weed management program, of your cropping system. And if you have a good diverse crop rotation and you're employing good cultural weed management practices, you should not have weed problems. Right? You should not be reliant on mechanical cultivation. It should just be something that you do just as an extra benefit, not the primary way that you're managing. Soil weed seed banks can be rapidly reduced for most species. So this idea of, once the seed's in the soil, it's going to stay there forever, I think we need to get that out of our heads. We need to think about the potential to really reduce and drive down our soil weed seed banks by preventing weed seed additions. Okay? So the false seed bed approach and bare fallow periods, they can clean up a lot of problems. And I really encourage you, if you have a field that's infested, that's not producing, not really yielding well, you might consider just taking that land out of production, doing some intensive cover cropping and bare fallowing, clean it up, and then go back into it, start cropping again. Okay? So intensive and extensive approaches can be very effective. The weed the soil, not the crop, and the right tool for the job. Those two different approaches, I set it up as a contrast there, but really it's a continuum. Okay? And so you need to figure out where you fit on that continuum, what's going to work for you. Again, both kind of approaches can be very effective. And then there are some new tools. If you're struggling with weeds, check out some of the new tools that are out there. The camera-guided cultivation equipment, and some perhaps the row shaver or inter-row mower. May be really could be really effective, and I think could be really helpful for if you're looking at ways to reduce tillage. So I'll stop here. Just want to make some acknowledgments and recognize people in my lab and our Organic Farmer Advisory Board, some great folks out in New York that have helped me along the way, and collaborators and graduate students. So